Elena Rodriguez was worth $4.2 billion when she nearly died on Copper Ridge Mountain, but the man who saved her life didn't know that. All Jake Thompson saw was a woman in expensive ski gear buried under 3 feet of snow, her muffled screams barely audible over the howling wind. He didn't hesitate, even though saving her meant missing his shift at the mountain lodge and losing the only income keeping him and his 8-year-old daughter from homelessness. What Jake didn't know was that he'd just rescued the most powerful woman in the American ski industry, someone who owned every major resort from Vermont to Colorado. And what Elena didn't know was that her rescuer was about to lose everything, despite being the kind of father who would give his last dollar to buy his sick daughter medicine. But when Elena discovered Jake's story 3 weeks later, what she did next would transform both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. The question was, could a man with nothing accept help from a woman who had everything, or would pride destroy the most unexpected friendship either had ever known? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Thompson's alarm clock had been broken for 6 months, but he didn't need it anymore. His daughter Lily's coughing fits started at 5 a.m. every morning, cutting through the paper-thin walls of their studio apartment like a blade through silence. He rolled off the pull-out couch that served as his bed, his back protesting against the cheap springs that had given up supporting him months ago. "Morning, sunshine," he whispered, scooping Lily into his arms as another coughing spell racked her small frame. At 8 years old, she weighed barely 50 pounds, her chronic asthma having stolen the robust health other children took for granted. The inhaler on her nightstand was nearly empty, another expense Jake would have to figure out before the week ended. Their apartment in Pine Valley was a far cry from the cozy cabin they'd shared with Lily's mother before the diagnosis changed everything. Before the medical bills started piling up like snowdrifts. Before Rebecca looked at their daughter's breathing treatments and decided she, quote, couldn't handle watching Lily struggle anymore. The day Rebecca packed her bags and left for California, she'd hugged Lily tight and promised to call every week. That was 18 months ago. The phone calls had stopped after 3. "Daddy, my chest hurts," Lily whispered against his shoulder, her small fist pressed against her sternum in the gesture that always made Jake's heart clench with helpless fear. "I know, baby girl, let's get your medicine." The inhaler cost $340 without insurance. Jake had been stretching the doses, rationing them like a wartime resource. But Lily needed what she needed. He'd figure out how to pay for groceries after he made sure she could breathe. Pine Valley Lodge had hired Jake as a maintenance worker 6 months ago when the tourist season demanded extra hands. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but it came with the promise of steady hours through ski season. What it didn't come with was health insurance, sick leave, or any understanding when single fathers had to choose between work and their children's doctor appointments. His phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor. "Thompson, need you on Avalanche patrol today. Rodriguez called in sick. Can you cover the backcountry routes?" Jake stared at the message, calculating quickly. Avalanche patrol paid double overtime, money he desperately needed. But it also meant leaving Lily with Mrs. Chen, their elderly neighbor who watched her when daycare wasn't available. Another debt he couldn't afford, but couldn't avoid. Meanwhile, 300 miles away in her Denver penthouse, Elena Rodriguez stood before floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that looked like a toy model from 40 stories up. Snow had been falling since midnight, the kind of heavy, wet snow that created perfect skiing conditions and billion-dollar revenue days across her empire. Rodriguez Ski Enterprises owned 23 resorts across 7 states. What had started as her grandfather's single slope in Colorado had grown into the largest privately owned ski operation in North America. Elena's business acumen and ruthless expansion strategy had turned family tradition into a media empire that employed over 15,000 people and influenced winter tourism policy across the continent. A wave. But standing in her pristine apartment, surrounded by awards and accolades that represented decades of 18-hour days and missed holidays, Elena felt as empty as the expensive space she called home. "Ms. Rodriguez," her assistant Patricia's voice came through the intercom. "Your helicopter is waiting for the Pine Valley inspection. The weather window closes in 2 hours." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that had been getting worse over the past year. The panic attacks had started small. Moments of breathlessness during board meetings, racing heart when she walked into crowded rooms. Her doctor had prescribed medication and suggested therapy, but Elena couldn't afford to appear weak. Not when she was the only woman running a major ski corporation. Not when every business decision was scrutinized through the lens of whether a female CEO could handle the pressure. "Tell the pilot I'll be down in 10 minutes, she said, straightening her shoulders and pushing the anxiety down where it belonged, buried under layers of professional competence and strategic thinking. The helicopter ride to Pine Valley should have been routine. Elena made surprise inspections of her properties monthly, ensuring that corporate standards were maintained and that local managers understood they were accountable to someone who noticed details. But as they approached Copper Ridge Mountain, the weather turned violent with the sudden fury that made mountain flying dangerous. "Ms. Rodriguez, we should turn back," the pilot's voice crackled through her headset. "Wind shear is getting dangerous, and visibility is dropping fast." Elena looked down at Pine Valley Lodge through the swirling snow. The resort was one of her smaller properties, but it served as a crucial access point for backcountry skiing. If safety protocols weren't being followed, if equipment wasn't properly maintained, people could die. And deaths meant lawsuits, bad publicity, and the kind of corporate liability that destroyed reputations overnight. "Set us down at the emergency landing pad," she ordered. "I'll inspect on foot and meet you back here in 2 hours." What Elena didn't know was that she'd just made the decision that would change everything. Because Jake Thompson was already suited up for Avalanche patrol, already checking his rescue equipment, already preparing to venture into the exact backcountry area where Elena Rodriguez's helicopter would deposit the most powerful woman in American skiing into conditions that would test whether money could buy survival when nature decided to remind humans how small they really were. The storm was intensifying, and in 30 minutes both their lives would intersect in a moment of crisis that would reveal what really mattered when everything else was stripped away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake Thompson's day had started at 4:30 a.m. with Lily's coughing fit, but by 6 a.m. he was already strapping on his Avalanche rescue gear in the Pine Valley Lodge equipment room. The storm had dumped 18 inches of fresh powder overnight, beautiful for skiers, deadly for anyone caught in the wrong place when the mountain decided to move. "Thompson, you take sectors 7 through 12, barked Mike Harrison, the head of mountain safety. "Weather Service says we've got a high avalanche risk today, especially on the north-facing slopes above timberline. Radio check every 30 minutes, and don't be a hero if you see anything sketchy." Jake nodded, testing his avalanche beacon one final time before heading out into the storm. Sector 7 was the most remote area of Pine Valley's backcountry, steep terrain that attracted expert skiers and rescue workers in equal measure. It was also the area where people got into trouble when they overestimated their abilities and underestimated the mountain's power. The wind was howling at 40 miles per hour as Jake made his way up the ridge, his skis cutting through snow that felt heavy and unstable beneath him. Every step triggered small sloughs of snow that cascaded down the slope, nature's warning that bigger things were waiting to break loose. Meanwhile, Elena Rodriguez was discovering that all her money and corporate power meant nothing when faced with a Colorado blizzard. The helicopter had managed to land on the emergency pad, but barely. The pilot was already talking about immediate departure, about weather windows closing, about the kind of liability that came with flying expensive executives into conditions that grounded commercial aviation. "Ms. Rodriguez, we need to leave now," Captain Stevens shouted over the rotor noise. "This storm is moving faster than forecasted, and if we don't take off in the next 10 minutes, we're stuck here until it passes." Elena looked across the landing pad toward Pine Valley Lodge, its lights barely visible through the driving snow. She'd flown 300 miles to conduct this inspection, had cleared her schedule for the entire day, had promised the board that she would personally verify safety protocols at their most remote property. The idea of turning back without accomplishing her mission felt like failure, and Elena Rodriguez hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by accepting failure. "Give me 45 minutes, she called back. I'll ski down to the lodge, conduct my inspection, and meet you back here. Ma'am, I strongly advise against. 45 minutes, Captain. That's an order. Elena had been skiing since she was 3 years old. She'd grown up on these mountains, had earned her expert rating before she turned 16, had spent countless hours on slopes that would terrify recreational skiers. But what she didn't account for was the way success and wealth had insulated her from real risk. It had been 2 years since she'd skied anything more challenging than groomed runs at her flagship resorts. 2 years since she'd tested herself against conditions that couldn't be controlled by snow machines and safety crews. The slope she chose was marked as expert terrain, a steep descent that would take her directly to the lodge's back entrance. Under normal conditions, it would have been an exhilarating but manageable run. But these weren't normal conditions, and Elena was about to learn that mountains didn't care about stock portfolios or corporate hierarchies. She was halfway down the slope when she felt it. The subtle shift beneath her skis that every experienced skier dreaded. The snow was moving, not just the surface layer but the deep pack underneath. She'd triggered something big, something that was about to become unstoppable. The avalanche started with a crack that sounded like thunder, a fracture line that spread across the slope faster than Elena could react. Suddenly, she wasn't skiing anymore. She was riding a river of snow that moved with the power of a freight train and the unpredictability of a living thing. Training kicked in. Elena tried to stay on top of the slide, swimming through the churning snow, fighting to keep her head above the surface as the avalanche carried her down the mountain. But snow is heavier than water, and mountains are stronger than human will. Within seconds, she was tumbling, disoriented, buried under tons of snow that pressed against her chest like concrete. Jake Thompson was checking his radio when he heard it, the deep rumble that made experienced mountain workers stop everything and listen. Avalanche. Somewhere close, somewhere in his patrol sector. He switched his radio to emergency frequency and started moving toward the sound, his heart racing with the adrenaline that came with knowing someone might be dying while he raced against time. Mountain Rescue, this is Thompson in Sector 7. He radioed while skiing as fast as conditions allowed. I've got avalanche activity on the north face above tree line. Investigating now. Copy that, Thompson. Be advised we have no skiers checked out for backcountry access in that area today. That should have been reassuring, but Jake's instincts were telling him otherwise. The avalanche had been big. He could see the debris field even through the storm. And something was nagging at him. Some detail that suggested this wasn't just a natural slide triggered by wind and new snow. He found the first clue 300 yards upslope from the debris pile, a single ski pole. Expensive carbon fiber with custom grips that cost more than Jake made in a week. Someone had been caught in the slide, and they were somewhere underneath thousands of tons of snow. Jake activated his avalanche beacon and started sweeping the debris field methodically, listening for the electronic signal that would lead him to whoever was buried. The storm was getting worse, visibility dropping to almost zero. But he kept searching, because that's what mountain rescue workers did. They searched until they found someone, or until they were certain no one could be found. The beacon started beeping when he was almost ready to give up. Faint at first, then stronger as he triangulated the signal. Someone was 15 feet beneath the surface, somewhere in the middle of the debris field, where the snow had settled like concrete. 15 feet might as well have been 50. Without proper equipment, without a full rescue team, it was essentially impossible. But Jake Thompson had learned long ago that impossible was just another word for difficult. He'd been told it was impossible to raise a chronically ill child on a maintenance worker's salary. Impossible to keep Lily healthy without health insurance. Impossible to build a stable life from the wreckage of his marriage and financial collapse. He'd proven impossible wrong before. He started digging. The snow was packed hard, compressed by the weight of the slide into something that felt more like ice than powder. Each shovelful was a victory measured in inches. Each breath a reminder that somewhere beneath him, someone else was fighting for air. Jake dug with the methodical intensity of someone who understood that other people's lives sometimes depended on your willingness to keep working when work felt hopeless. 20 minutes in, his shovel hit something that wasn't snow. Fabric. Expensive ski jacket fabric that meant he'd found whoever the beacon was tracking. Jake cleared snow away from what he hoped was a face, working faster now, adrenaline replacing the fatigue that had been building in his shoulders and back. Elena Rodriguez emerged from her snow tomb unconscious but breathing, her face blue with cold and oxygen deprivation. Jake cleared the snow from around her chest and shoulders, checking for obvious injuries before making the decision that would change both their lives. The storm was too severe for helicopter evacuation. The ski patrol was dealing with 3 other emergencies. If Elena was going to survive, Jake would have to get her down the mountain himself. He loaded her onto his rescue sled and started the treacherous descent to Pine Valley Lodge, fighting winds that tried to blow them both off the mountain while monitoring Elena's breathing and vital signs. It took 90 minutes to cover terrain that should have taken 20, but when they finally reached the lodge's medical station, Elena was alive. She was also completely unconscious, which meant Jake had no way of knowing that he'd just saved the life of the most powerful woman in American skiing. To him, she was just another skier who'd made a bad decision and paid the price. Another person who'd needed help and received it, because that's what decent people did for each other. What Jake didn't know was that Elena Rodriguez's assistant was already mobilizing a search and rescue operation that included 2 helicopters, a full mountain rescue team, and enough resources to buy and sell Pine Valley Lodge 3 times over. And when Elena woke up in the lodge's medical station 6 hours later, the first thing she would want to know was the name of the man who'd pulled her out of what should have been her grave. The second thing she would want to know was how to repay a debt that couldn't be measured in money. Elena Rodriguez woke up 18 hours later in a private room at Denver General Hospital, her throat raw from the ventilator and her memory fragmented like broken glass. The last clear image she retained was the crack of the avalanche starting beneath her skis. Everything after that existed in flashes. The sensation of tumbling, the crushing weight of snow, and then nothing until the steady beeping of hospital monitors pulled her back to consciousness. "Ms. Rodriguez, thank God you're awake." Patricia Chen, her assistant of 8 years, was sitting beside the bed with dark circles under her eyes and the kind of exhaustion that came from coordinating emergency operations across multiple states. "The doctors weren't sure when you'd regain consciousness. You've been sedated for almost a day." Elena tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "What happened? How did I get here?" "A maintenance worker at Pine Valley Lodge pulled you out of an avalanche," Patricia explained, consulting her ever-present tablet. "According to the incident report, you were buried under 15 feet of snow for approximately 25 minutes. The rescue was, well, it was miraculous. Most people don't survive that kind of burial." The words hit Elena like physical blows. 15 feet of snow, 25 minutes without air. She should be dead, would be dead, if not for someone whose name she didn't even know. "The maintenance worker. What's his name? I need to thank him." Patricia hesitated, and Elena recognized the expression that meant her assistant was navigating delicate corporate territory. "Jake Thompson, single father, works part-time for Pine Valley Lodge. Ms. Rodriguez, there's something else. The rescue. It's going to be a public relations situation." Local news has already picked up the story. "Billionaire CEO saved by heroic lodge worker." That's the headline in the Rocky Mountain Times. Elena closed her eyes, feeling a familiar surge of anxiety. Media attention was the last thing she needed, especially when it portrayed her as reckless and vulnerable. The ski industry was unforgiving toward executives who appeared to make poor decisions, and female CEOs faced even harsher scrutiny. Board members were probably already questioning her judgment, wondering if the stress of running Rodriguez Ski Enterprises was affecting her decision-making. "Have there been any statements from Mr. Thompson?" Elena asked. "That's the interesting part. He hasn't talked to any reporters. Declined all interview requests. According to lodge management, he just went back to work the next day like nothing happened. No social media posts, no attempts to capitalize on the story. It's almost like he doesn't realize what he's done." Meanwhile, 300 miles away in Pine Valley, Jake Thompson was discovering that heroism came with complications he hadn't anticipated. The story of Elena's rescue had somehow reached national news outlets, and Pine Valley Lodge was being flooded with interview requests, book deal inquiries, and what the lodge manager euphemistically called opportunity presentations. Jake wanted no part of any of it. He'd signed a non-disclosure agreement as a condition of his employment, which meant he couldn't discuss guest incidents with media even if he wanted to. More importantly, he'd been raised to believe that helping people in crisis was a basic human obligation, not a platform for self-promotion. But the attention was creating problems he hadn't foreseen. His landlord had raised his rent after seeing Jake's name in the newspaper, claiming that local celebrities should pay market rates for their apartments. 3 different production companies had offered him money for his story, amounts that would solve his financial problems but require him to violate the trust Pine Valley Lodge had placed in him. Most troubling of all, Lily's condition was worsening. The stress of the media attention seemed to be triggering more frequent asthma attacks, and their pediatrician was recommending a specialist consultation that would cost $2,000, even with the payment plan Jake had negotiated. "Daddy, why are those people with cameras outside our building?" Lily asked as Jake helped her with her breathing treatment that morning. She was sitting on his lap in their tiny kitchenette, the nebulizer humming while medication mist filled her small lungs. "They want to talk about work stuff," Jake said carefully, "but we don't have to talk to them if we don't want to." "Are we in trouble?" The question broke Jake's heart. At 8 years old, Lily had already learned to associate unusual attention with problems, to worry about adult concerns that should never touch children's lives. "No, sweetheart. We're not in trouble. Daddy just helped someone who needed help. And sometimes people want to hear about that." What Jake didn't tell Lily was that Pine Valley Lodge's management was pressuring him to participate in at least some media opportunities. The publicity was driving record booking numbers, and the lodge's corporate owners were eager to capitalize on the positive attention. Jake's employment contract included clauses about cooperation with company marketing efforts, clauses that his supervisor was beginning to interpret broadly. His phone rang as he was getting Lily ready for school. The caller ID showed a Denver area code he didn't recognize. "Mr. Thompson? This is Dr. Sarah Martinez from Denver General Hospital. I'm calling on behalf of a patient who was recently in your care." Jake's stomach clenched. "Is she all right? Did something happen?" "She's recovering well thanks to your quick action. Mr. Thompson, I'm calling because my patient would like to speak with you. She's asked me to arrange a phone call if you're willing." Jake hesitated. Every instinct told him that getting involved with the woman he'd rescued would complicate an already difficult situation. But she'd nearly died on his mountain, had spent over 20 minutes buried in snow while he dug her out. If she wanted to say thank you, he could at least listen. "I suppose that would be okay," he said finally. "Excellent. She's available this afternoon if that works for you. And Mr. Thompson, she wanted me to tell you that she understands you've been receiving media attention about the rescue. She wants you to know that she had nothing to do with the story reaching the press, and she's prepared to make a statement asking for your privacy to be respected." After Dr. Martinez hung up, Jake sat in his kitchen staring at his phone and wondering what kind of person commanded enough influence to make statements about media coverage from a hospital bed. Pine Valley Lodge catered to wealthy clientele, but someone requesting privacy statements through hospital staff suggested resources that went beyond typical resort guests. His landlord chose that moment to knock on the door, holding an eviction notice that made Jake's blood run cold. 30 days to vacate the premises due to lease violations and failure to disclose celebrity status affecting property value. It was legal nonsense, but fighting it would require lawyer fees Jake couldn't afford and time he didn't have. Lily emerged from the bathroom, dressed for school and carrying the backpack that held her emergency inhaler and the medical action plan that had become as essential as her textbooks. She looked at the official papers in Jake's hands with the too serious expression that meant she understood more about their situation than any 8-year-old should. "Are we moving again, Daddy?" Jake knelt down to her level, forcing his voice to remain calm and reassuring. "We might need to find a new place, but we'll figure it out together. We always do, right?" Lily nodded solemnly, then surprised him by wrapping her small arms around his neck. "I love you, Daddy, even if we have to live in the truck sometimes." The casual acceptance in her voice, the matter-of-fact acknowledgement that homelessness was a possibility she'd already considered, nearly undid Jake's composure. No child should have to factor sleeping in vehicles into their understanding of family life. No father should have to explain to his daughter why doing the right thing had made their lives more difficult instead of easier. As Jake walked Lily to school, dodging the 2 photographers who'd stationed themselves outside their apartment building, he thought about the phone call he'd agreed to have that afternoon. Maybe the woman he'd rescued could answer some questions about why helping people seemed to create more problems than it solved. Maybe she could explain why doing what felt morally right often felt practically impossible. What Jake didn't know was that Elena Rodriguez was asking herself the same questions from her hospital bed, staring at financial reports that showed her company thriving while the man who'd saved her life struggled to pay rent. She was beginning to understand that true debt couldn't be measured in dollars, and that some obligations transcended the business relationships that had defined her entire adult life. The phone call that afternoon would change everything for both of them, though neither could have predicted how or why. The phone call came at 3:47 p.m. while Jake was sitting in his truck outside Lily's school, watching other parents pick up their children and wondering how many of them had to choose between gas money and grocery money each week. His hands were still shaking from the conversation with his landlord's lawyer, who'd made it clear that celebrity status, even unwanted celebrity status, constituted grounds for immediate lease termination under the building's occupancy agreement. "Mr. Thompson, this is Elena Rodriguez." Her voice was softer than Jake had expected, roughened by what he assumed were after-effects from her ordeal. He'd imagined someone more commanding, more corporate, based on the way hospital staff and lodge management had spoken about her with barely concealed reverence. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked, because that seemed more important than whatever formal thank you speech she'd prepared. "Alive, thanks to you." Elena paused, and Jake could hear something that sounded like tears being held back. "Mr. Thompson, I've been trying to figure out how to thank someone for giving you your life back, and I'm coming up empty. What do you say to someone who dug you out of your own grave?" "You don't say anything," Jake replied. "You just get better and make sure it doesn't happen again." Elena laughed, a sound that carried both gratitude and something that might have been relief. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. Mr. Thompson, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Has the media attention from the rescue caused problems for you?" Jake looked through his windshield at the school playground where Lily would emerge in 10 minutes, her backpack loaded with homework she'd completed their kitchen table while he tried to figure out how to pay for her next doctor's appointment. "Some problems, yeah, but nothing I can't handle." "What kind of problems?" The direct question caught Jake off guard. Most people asked about problems without actually wanting specifics, using concern as conversational politeness rather than genuine inquiry. But Elena's voice carried the tone of someone who was prepared to listen to real answers. "Landlord wants us out. Says having a tenant in the news affects property values. Lily's been having more asthma attacks since the photographer started hanging around our building, and her doctor wants to run some tests that—" Jake stopped himself. This woman had nearly died, was calling from a hospital bed to thank him, and here he was complaining about problems that weren't her fault or responsibility. "Tests that what, Mr. Thompson?" "Tests that cost money I don't have. But that's not your problem. You didn't ask to be rescued, and you shouldn't have to hear about the consequences." Elena was quiet for so long that Jake wondered if the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, carrying a weight that suggested important decisions being made in real time. "Mr. Thompson, I need to tell you something about who I am, and then I need to ask you for a favor. Is that all right?" "I guess so." "My name is Elena Rodriguez, and I own Rodriguez Ski Enterprises. We operate 23 ski resorts across 7 states, including Pine Valley Lodge where you work. I was at Pine Valley that day to conduct a surprise inspection when I made a series of very poor decisions that nearly cost me my life." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. Elena Rodriguez. He'd heard the name in lodge staff meetings, spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for mythological figures. The owner of not just Pine Valley, but half the major ski resorts in the western United States. A billionaire who could buy and sell small towns without affecting her quarterly budget. "Mr. Thompson, are you still there?" "Yeah, I'm here. I didn't know. I specifically didn't want you to know. When someone saves your life, you want to believe they did it because you're worth saving as a person, not because of what you might be able to do for them financially. Does knowing who I am change how you feel about what happened?" Jake considered the question seriously. Did it change anything? He'd seen a person buried in snow and had dug until he found them. The fact that the person owned the mountain where it happened seemed irrelevant to the basic human equation of helping someone who needed help. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't change anything." "Good. That's what I hoped you'd say, and it's why I want to ask you for this favor." Elena took a breath that Jake could hear through the phone. "I want to offer you a position with Rodriguez Ski Enterprises. Nothing to do with the rescue, nothing to do with gratitude or obligation. We need someone with mountain rescue experience to head up our safety operations across all properties. It's a real job with real responsibilities, and it comes with benefits that would include comprehensive health coverage for your family." Jake's heart started beating faster. Health insurance for Lily meant specialist appointments without payment plans, meant saying yes to treatments instead of calculating costs first, meant not having to choose between her medicine and their rent. "What kind of position?" he asked carefully. "Director of Mountain Safety Operations. You'd oversee rescue protocols, train staff at all our resorts, develop safety standards that could save lives across the industry. The salary would be $85,000 annually, plus performance bonuses, plus full family health coverage, plus housing allowances for relocation." The numbers hit Jake like physical blows. $85,000 was more than he'd made in the past 3 years combined. Health insurance would transform Lily's medical care from crisis management to preventative treatment. But something about the timing, about the coincidence of this opportunity appearing days after the rescue, made his pride rear up in defense. "Ms. Rodriguez, I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept a job just because I pulled you out of an avalanche." "You're not accepting a job because you rescued me. You're accepting a job because you're qualified for it, because we need someone with your experience, and because you'd be good at it. The timing is coincidental." "Is it?" Elena was quiet again, and when she spoke, Jake heard something that sounded like vulnerability carefully controlled. "No, it's not coincidental. I've been looking for someone to fill this position for 8 months. But I've also been looking for a way to thank you that doesn't insult either of us. This job needs to be filled, you're qualified to fill it, and it would solve some problems for both of us. Is that so terrible?" Jake watched through his windshield as Lily emerged from the school building, her small figure bundled in a coat that was too thin for Colorado winters, but the warmest they could afford. She was scanning the pickup area for his truck, her face lighting up when she spotted him. In 30 seconds, she'd climb into the passenger seat and ask about his day, and he'd have to figure out how to explain that they might be homeless by the end of the month. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course. But Mr. Thompson, don't let pride make decisions that affect your daughter's health. Sometimes accepting help is the bravest thing you can do." After Elena hung up, Jake sat in his truck processing what had just happened. A job offer that would solve every financial problem his family faced, from someone who had every reason to want to help him but who claimed the help was really mutual benefit. It felt too good to be true, which in Jake's experience usually meant it was. But Lily was climbing into the truck now, chattering about her day at school, and Jake found himself imagining what it would feel like to say yes to her next doctor's appointment without calculating the cost. To move her into a real bedroom instead of a corner of their studio apartment. To stop rationing her inhaler doses and start focusing on helping her get better. "Daddy, you look funny," Lily observed, studying his face with the perceptive intensity that 8-year-olds brought to reading adult emotions. "Did something good happen?" Jake looked at his daughter, whose medical needs had been driving every decision he'd made for the past 2 years, whose future depended on his ability to swallow his pride and accept help from someone who might actually want to give it. "Maybe, sweetheart," he said, starting the truck and beginning to understand that sometimes the right choice was also the hardest choice. "Maybe something very good happened." Jake spent 3 sleepless nights weighing Elena's offer before making his decision. The final push came when Lily woke up at 2 a.m. with an asthma attack severe enough to require a trip to the emergency room. As he sat in the waiting area at Valley Medical Center, watching his daughter struggle to breathe while a billing clerk discussed payment options, Jake realized that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He called Elena the next morning. "I'd like to accept the position," he said without preamble when she answered her phone. "But I have conditions." "I'm listening." Elena's voice was professional but warm, suggesting she'd been hoping for this call. "First, I want a probationary period. 6 months to prove I can do the job based on merit, not gratitude. If I'm not performing at the level you need, you let me go without any awkwardness about the rescue situation." "Agreed. What else?" "Second, I want to start at Pine Valley before moving to corporate oversight. I need to learn your systems from the ground up, understand how decisions made at the executive level affect day-to-day operations." Elena paused, and Jake could almost hear her recalculating timelines and organizational charts. "That's actually smart. Most executives never see the operational side of resort management. How long were you thinking? 2 months at Pine Valley, then gradual expansion to other properties. I want to visit every resort in your network before I start making policy decisions that affect people's jobs. Mr. Thompson, you do realize that approach will take almost a year? Ms. Rodriguez, you do realize that safety policies created by people who don't understand mountain operations are usually the ones that get people killed. Elena laughed, a sound that carried genuine amusement rather than polite acknowledgement. Point taken. Anything else? Jake hesitated before voicing his final concern. The media attention from the rescue. I need your word that this job has nothing to do with public relations or corporate image management. I won't be your poster boy for feel-good rescue stories. You have my word. In fact, I'd prefer to keep your hiring as quiet as possible. The ski industry is small, and I don't want competitors thinking I make personnel decisions based on personal relationships. After they worked out logistics, start date, temporary housing at Pine Valley, arrangements for Lily's school transfer, Jake hung up the phone and sat in his truck, trying to process the fact that his life had just changed completely. In 6 weeks, he'd be earning more money than he'd ever imagined, with health insurance that would transform Lily's medical care from crisis management to comprehensive treatment. But first, he had to survive the remaining weeks at Pine Valley Lodge while managing the media attention that continued to swirl around the rescue story. Local news stations had picked up the narrative of the heroic maintenance worker who'd saved a billionaire's life, and the story had taken on a life of its own in social media circles that celebrated working-class heroes standing up for regular people. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that accepting Elena's job offer would essentially end the narrative that had made him briefly famous. Hero maintenance worker becomes corporate executive wasn't the kind of story that captured public imagination the way David vs. Goliath rescue tales did. Mike Harrison, the head of mountain safety, cornered Jake in the equipment room 3 days after he'd accepted Elena's offer. Thompson, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Are you planning to leave Pine Valley? Jake had been dreading this conversation. Mike had given him opportunities when other employers wouldn't hire someone with his limited formal education, had trusted him with responsibilities that paid barely above minimum wage but taught him skills worth far more than his salary reflected. I've been offered a position with Rodriguez Ski Enterprises, Jake said carefully. Corporate level, overseeing safety operations across multiple properties. Mike stared at him for a long moment, then started laughing. Jesus, Thompson, you pull the owner out of an avalanche and suddenly you're management material? The comment hit Jake harder than it should have, mostly because it echoed his own doubts about whether he was qualified for the position Elena had offered. It's not because of the rescue, he said defensively. The job requires mountain rescue experience, and I have 8 years of wilderness emergency response training. 8 years of training that you got working for peanuts at places like this, Mike pointed out. Don't get me wrong, I'm happy for you. But you might want to think about whether you're ready for the kind of politics that come with corporate positions. Rich people's gratitude doesn't always translate into long-term job security. The warning stayed with Jake as he began the process of transitioning his responsibilities at Pine Valley. Mike wasn't wrong about the politics of corporate employment, or about the potential complications of accepting a job from someone who owed him a life debt. But Jake had spent 2 years watching Lily ration her inhaler doses and sleeping on a pull-out couch in a studio apartment. If Elena's offer came with risks, those risks seemed manageable compared to the certainty of continued financial struggle. Meanwhile, Elena was discovering that hiring Jake Thompson involved complications she hadn't anticipated. Her board of directors had questions about bringing an unknown maintenance worker into an executive-level position without following standard recruitment protocols. Her legal team was concerned about the liability implications of hiring someone connected to her recent accident. Her public relations department wanted to craft a narrative around the hiring that Elena specifically didn't want to create. Patricia, schedule a conference call with the board for Friday afternoon. Elena instructed her assistant during their morning briefing. I need to address their concerns about the Thompson hiring before they start making it a bigger issue than it needs to be. What should I tell them about the agenda? Tell them we're discussing the expansion of our safety operations and the qualifications necessary for oversight positions. Don't mention the rescue unless someone specifically brings it up. Elena had spent her career building Rodriguez Ski Enterprises through strategic decisions based on business logic rather than emotional impulses. The board's skepticism about Jake's hiring was understandable, even reasonable. given that she was creating a position for someone she'd known for less than a week. But what the board didn't understand was that Elena's near-death experience had clarified something important about corporate leadership. She'd built a company focused on profit margins and market expansion while losing sight of the human element that made ski resorts more than just entertainment businesses. Jake Thompson represented an opportunity to integrate genuine mountain expertise with corporate decision-making, to ensure that safety protocols were designed by people who understood the real-world consequences of policy failures. The conference call with the board went exactly as Elena had expected. Questions about Jake's formal education, high school diploma, various wilderness certifications, concerns about his lack of corporate management experience, pointed inquiries about whether Elena's judgment might be compromised by gratitude related to recent events. "Directors, I appreciate your diligence in questioning personnel decisions," Elena said when the concerns had been fully aired, "but I'd like to remind you that our current safety protocols were developed by consultants with impressive credentials and no practical mountain rescue experience. Last month, those protocols nearly failed to prevent a fatality at our Whistle Peak property. Mr. Thompson's qualifications include 8 years of successful rescue operations in conditions that would challenge our current safety standards." Board member James Mitchell, who'd been questioning the hiring most aggressively, leaned forward on the video call. "Elena, no one doubts Mr. Thompson's rescue abilities. But running safety operations across 23 properties requires management skills, budget oversight, personnel coordination. Are we creating a position for him, or filling a position we actually need?" Elena had been prepared for this question. "We've been operating without centralized safety oversight for 2 years. Each property develops its own protocols, purchases its own equipment, trains its own staff. The result is inconsistent standards and duplicated costs. A director of mountain safety operations would standardize procedures, centralize equipment purchasing, and provide expert oversight that could prevent lawsuits and save lives. The position justifies itself financially, regardless of who fills it." The board approved Jake's hiring by a narrow margin, but Elena could sense the underlying skepticism that would follow his performance. Jake Thompson would have to prove himself not just to Elena, but to a group of executives who viewed his lack of formal credentials as a liability rather than an asset. As Elena ended the conference call, she found herself hoping that her instincts about Jake's potential were correct. Because if this hiring decision backfired, it wouldn't just affect Jake's career prospects. It would confirm every doubt the board harbored about her judgment and potentially undermine her authority in ways that could affect the entire company. But watching Jake work during the rescue, seeing his methodical competence under pressure, Elena believed she was betting on someone whose practical intelligence was worth more than any MBA credential. The question was whether Jake would be able to navigate corporate politics as skillfully as he navigated avalanche debris. Jake's first day as Director of Mountain Safety Operations began at 6 a.m. in the Pine Valley Lodge conference room, where Elena Rodriguez sat waiting with 3 cups of coffee and a stack of incident reports that reached nearly 6 inches high. She'd driven up from Denver the night before, ostensibly to oversee Jake's transition, but really because she wanted to see how he handled his first corporate challenge. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Elena said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Despite the early hour, she looked polished and professional in a way that reminded Jake of the vast difference between their backgrounds. "I thought we'd start with the review of safety incidents across all properties from the past 18 months. Jake poured himself coffee and opened the first report, immediately recognizing the clinical language that reduced human emergencies to statistical data points. Whistle Peak Resort, December 15th. Skier collision resulting in traumatic brain injury. Contributing factors: inadequate signage, insufficient patrol coverage on intermediate terrain. What's your assessment?" Elena asked, watching Jake's face as he processed the information. "Someone's dead because we didn't put up a sign and didn't have enough people watching the mountain." Jake's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "The report makes it sound like an unavoidable accident, but inadequate signage and insufficient patrol coverage are budget decisions, not acts of God." Elena felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that Jake understood the human cost of corporate cost-cutting in ways that financial reports couldn't capture. "The family sued for $12 million. We settled for $8 million. How much would proper signage and additional patrol staff have cost?" "Approximately $40,000 per season." Jake set down the report and looked directly at Elena. "So we saved $40,000 and spent $8 million because we were too cheap to prevent a preventable death." That's a rather blunt assessment. Ms. Rodriguez, you didn't hire me to make corporate decisions sound better than they are. You hired me to prevent people from dying on your mountains. Sometimes that requires acknowledging that we've been prioritizing profit margins over human lives. Elena had expected Jake to be intimidated by corporate complexity, to defer to established protocols and existing management structures. Instead, he was cutting through layers of bureaucratic language to identify fundamental problems with the kind of clarity that came from understanding consequences in personal rather than abstract terms. What would you recommend? Jake flipped through several more reports, identifying patterns that painted a troubling picture of systematic safety failures across Elena's resort network. I'd recommend we stop pretending that cutting safety budgets is good business. Every one of these incidents was preventable, with proper staffing, equipment, or protocols. We're not just risking lawsuits. We're risking lives, because someone in a corporate office decided that safety was an acceptable place to reduce expenses. Elena found herself simultaneously impressed and concerned by Jake's directness. She'd built Rodriguez Ski Enterprises through careful political maneuvering and strategic compromise, approaches that had made her wealthy, but apparently hadn't made her resorts as safe as they could be. Jake, she said, using his first name for the first time in a professional context, I need you to understand something about how corporate decisions work. Safety improvements require board approval, budget allocations, coordination across multiple properties. You can't just identify problems and expect immediate solutions. Why not? The question caught Elena off guard, because that's not how large organizations function. Changes require consensus, planning, gradual implementation. How many people die while we're building consensus? Elena was quiet for a moment, processing the uncomfortable truth that Jake's question contained. She'd spent so many years managing corporate politics that she'd forgotten how simple moral equations could be when you stripped away institutional complexity. What would you do if you had complete authority to implement safety changes across all properties? She asked. Jake pulled out a notebook he'd been carrying and opened to pages covered with handwritten observations from his years working mountain rescue. Immediate changes. Double patrol staffing on all intermediate and expert terrain. Install collision prevention barriers at every merge point between different difficulty levels. Require annual rescue training for all lift operators and lodge staff. Long-term changes. Standardize equipment across all properties so rescue teams can work efficiently at any resort. Create a centralized incident database so we can identify patterns before they become fatal. Do you have any idea what that would cost? Less than we spent settling lawsuits last year, and significantly less than we'll spend when the next preventable death makes national news, and people start questioning whether Rodriguez Ski Enterprises cares more about profit than public safety. Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest that she'd been experiencing more frequently since her Avalanche accident. Jake was right, and his rightness made her defensive in ways that surprised her. She'd built her career on making strategic compromises, on finding middle ground between ideal solutions and financial realities. But sitting across from someone who'd risked his life to save hers, someone who understood the human cost of corporate decisions, those compromises felt less like business wisdom and more like moral failure. Jake, I appreciate your passion, but you need to understand that I answer to a board of directors who measure success in quarterly profit reports. They approved your hiring reluctantly, and they'll be watching your performance closely. Recommending massive budget increases in your first week might not be the best way to build credibility. Jake closed his notebook and looked at Elena with an expression that reminded her of why she'd been drawn to him in the first place. No calculation, no hidden agenda, just someone trying to do what seemed obviously right. Ms. Rodriguez, you asked me what I'd recommend. I'm recommending that we stop people from dying on our mountains. If the board thinks that's too expensive, maybe you need to decide whether you're running a ski company or a funeral home. The bluntness of the statement should have offended Elena. Instead, she found herself remembering the sensation of being buried under 15 feet of snow, the certainty that she was going to die because she'd made assumptions about risk that proved catastrophically wrong. Jake had saved her life by refusing to accept that some situations were hopeless. Maybe he could save her company by refusing to accept that some deaths were inevitable. What if I told you that implementing your recommendations would require me to fight battles with the board that I might not win? Elena asked. Then I'd ask why you hired me to identify problems you're not willing to solve. Elena stood up and walked to the conference room window, looking out at the mountain where Jake had pulled her from what should have been her grave. The slopes looked peaceful from inside the lodge, but she knew they could become deadly in minutes when conditions changed and people made poor decisions. "Jake, I need to tell you something about why I really offered you this job." Jake waited, sensing that whatever Elena was about to say would be more honest than anything they'd discussed so far. "I didn't hire you just because you're qualified, though you are. I hired you because when I was dying under that snow, you didn't calculate the risks, or consider the liability implications, or worry about whether saving me was cost-effective. You just did what needed to be done. I'm hoping you can bring that same approach to corporate safety decisions. Are you prepared for the consequences of that approach?" Elena turned back to face Jake, seeing in his expression the same steady competence that had convinced her to trust him with her life. "I'm hoping you'll help me figure out what those consequences are." Jake reopened his notebook and began writing. "Then let's start with Whistle Peak Resort. If we can't prevent deaths at one property, we have no business managing 23. As Elena watched Jake work, she realized that hiring him had been less about gratitude and more about recognizing something in herself that she'd lost somewhere in the process of building a corporate empire. The willingness to do what was right even when it was difficult, even when it was expensive, even when it required fighting battles that seemed unwinnable. The question was whether she still had the courage to follow through on that recognition. 3 weeks into Jake's tenure as Director of Mountain Safety Operations, Elena found herself spending more time at Pine Valley Lodge than at her Denver headquarters. Officially, she was overseeing the implementation of new safety protocols. Unofficially, she was watching Jake Thompson transform not just how Pine Valley operated, but how she thought about the relationship between corporate leadership and human responsibility. The changes were immediate and visible. Jake had reorganized the Mountain Patrol schedule to ensure continuous coverage of high-risk areas, implemented mandatory radio check-ins every 15 minutes during active patrol, and established what he called safety zones at every trail intersection where patrol staff could assist skiers before problems became emergencies. "Ms. Rodriguez, you need to see this," Jake said, approaching Elena in the lodge's main lobby where she'd been reviewing quarterly reports on her laptop. He was carrying a tablet displaying what appeared to be a real-time map of the mountain, with colored dots representing patrol staff positions and weather monitoring data. "What am I looking at?" Live Safety Monitoring System. Every patrol member has a GPS tracker and emergency beacon. Weather stations across the mountain feed data directly to the patrol base, and we have automated alerts for conditions that might trigger avalanche risk or visibility problems. Jake swiped to another screen, showing incident tracking in real time. Yesterday we had 12 minor interventions. Lost skiers, equipment problems, first aid situations. All resolved before they became serious incidents. Elena studied the data, recognizing the kind of operational efficiency that had built her business empire. But this wasn't about profit margins or market expansion. This was about preventing the kind of preventable tragedies that had filled those incident reports they'd reviewed 3 weeks ago. How much did this system cost to implement? $47,000 for the technology, plus about $60,000 in additional patrol salaries for the increased staffing. Jake paused, anticipating Elena's next question. "The insurance company is offering a 15% reduction in our liability premiums because of the improved safety protocols. That saves us $93,000 per year, so the system pays for itself in 14 months. Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in corporate decision-making for years. The satisfaction of doing something that was both morally right and financially smart. "Have you calculated what it would cost to implement this across all properties?" "About $2.4 million for full implementation, with annual savings of approximately $4.7 million in reduced insurance costs and avoided litigation settlements. But that's not counting the most important benefit." "Which is?" Jake looked directly at Elena with a serious expression that meant he was about to say something that would challenge her thinking. "People get to go home to their families instead of going to the hospital. That's not something you can put in a quarterly report. But it's the only number that really matters." Elena closed her laptop, realizing that Jake had just articulated something she'd lost sight of, somewhere in the process of building Rodriguez Ski Enterprises into a corporate empire. The fundamental purpose of a ski resort wasn't to generate revenue. It was to provide families with experiences that created positive memories rather than traumatic ones. "Jake, I want you to present this system to the board of directors next week. full presentation, complete cost-benefit analysis, implementation timeline. Are you sure that's a good idea? They weren't exactly enthusiastic about hiring me in the first place. Elena had been wondering the same thing. The board's skepticism about Jake's qualifications hadn't diminished, and several directors had made pointed comments about Elena's judgment during recent meetings. But watching Jake's safety protocols prevent incidents that would have become lawsuits under the old system, Elena was beginning to understand that the board's resistance might be based more on protecting established practices than on legitimate business concerns. The board needs to see what effective safety management looks like, Elena said. And you need to understand how corporate decision-making works when people are more concerned about protecting their positions than solving problems. Meanwhile, Jake was discovering that his new role came with complexities he hadn't anticipated. The other department heads at Pine Valley Lodge had initially welcomed his safety improvements, but as his protocols began affecting their operations, resistance was starting to emerge. "Thompson, we need to talk," said Carol Morrison, the lodge's food and beverage director, cornering Jake in the employee break room. "Your new radio check-in requirements are pulling my staff away from customer service. Yesterday, we had a 15-minute delay in room service because one of my workers was doing a safety check instead of delivering food." Jake poured himself coffee and considered how to respond. Carol wasn't wrong about the operational impacts, but she was thinking about safety as something that interfered with business rather than something that protected it. "Carol, what happens to customer service when one of your staff gets injured because we don't know where they are or what conditions they're working in?" "That's a hypothetical problem. Customer complaints about delayed service are happening right now. Last month, at our Aspen property, a housekeeper fell down a service stairway and wasn't found for 40 minutes because nobody knew her exact location. She ended up with a spinal injury that required surgery and 6 months of rehabilitation. Our liability settlement was $300,000, and we lost an experienced employee. How many room service delays would that money cover?" Carol's expression shifted as she processed the real-world consequences Jake was describing. This wasn't theoretical safety management. This was preventing specific, costly incidents that damaged both people and profits. "I hadn't thought about it that way," she admitted. "Most people don't, because we've been trained to think that safety procedures interfere with productivity instead of protecting it. But every injury, every incident, every lawsuit costs more than prevention would have cost." The conversation with Carol represented a pattern Jake was seeing across all departments. People who'd been working in the ski industry for years had learned to view safety as regulatory compliance rather than practical protection. Changing that mindset required demonstrating that safety improvements enhanced rather than hindered operational efficiency. Elena had been observing these interactions from a distance, impressed by Jake's ability to build consensus around changes that initially faced resistance. He didn't impose safety protocols through corporate authority. He convinced people by showing them how the changes would make their jobs easier and more effective. "Jake," Elena said, finding him in the patrol office that evening as he completed his daily incident reports, "I've been thinking about something you said during our first meeting, about starting with one property before expanding to others. What about it? I think Pine Valley should become our pilot program for comprehensive safety reform. If we can demonstrate that these protocols work here, both operationally and financially, it becomes much easier to justify implementing them across the entire network." Jake looked up from his paperwork, studying Elena's face for signs that this was corporate politics rather than genuine commitment to safety improvement. "Are you prepared for the board to ask why we're spending money on solutions to problems that other properties haven't officially acknowledged having?" "I'm prepared to tell them that we're being proactive instead of reactive, that we're preventing problems instead of managing crises after they happen." Elena sat down across from Jake, recognizing in his steady competence the same qualities that had convinced her to trust him with her life during the Avalanche rescue. "Jake, I need to ask you something. Do you think I hired you because I was grateful, or because I recognized something about leadership that I'd lost sight of?" Jake considered the question seriously before answering. "I think you hired me because you almost died, and it reminded you that some things matter more than quarterly profit reports. The question is whether you'll remember that when the board starts pressuring you to prioritize short-term revenue over long-term safety." Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had been occurring more frequently since her accident, but this time it wasn't anxiety, it was recognition. Jake was right about why she'd hired him. And he was right about the challenges they'd face implementing changes that prioritized human welfare over financial optimization. Then I guess we'll find out next week whether I've learned anything from nearly dying on my own mountain. The board presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday that began with the worst possible news. Jake's phone rang at 5:47 a.m. with the call every safety director dreads. There had been a fatality at Whistle Peak Resort, Rodriguez Ski Enterprises, flagship property in Colorado. Mr. Thompson, this is David Chen, Mountain Operations Manager at Whistle Peak. We've had a serious incident. Experienced skier, expert terrain, but he went off-piste into an unmarked backcountry area and triggered an avalanche. Didn't survive. Jake sat up in his bed at the Pine Valley staff housing, his mind immediately shifting into crisis management mode. What are the details? Was he skiing alone? Were there any witnesses? Solo skier, no witnesses to the actual incident. A helicopter crew spotted the debris field during a routine flight and called it in. Recovery teams found his body about 2 hours ago. David's voice carried the exhausted strain that came with managing tragedy while simultaneously trying to protect the resort from liability claims. Was the area properly marked as off-limits? The pause before David answered told Jake everything he needed to know. There was some confusion about the boundary markers. We'd planned to update the signage before the season started, but budget constraints delayed the project. Jake closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of preventable tragedy. Another death that could have been avoided with proper safety protocols. Another family destroyed because someone in a corporate office had decided that warning signs were an acceptable place to cut expenses. "I'll be there in 4 hours," Jake said. "Don't talk to any media, don't make any statements about cause or liability, and don't let anyone from corporate make decisions about the incident response until I've assessed the situation." Jake's second call was to Elena, who answered on the first ring despite the early hour. "Elena, we have a problem. Fatal avalanche at Whistle Peak, and it sounds like inadequate boundary marking was a contributing factor." Elena was quiet for a moment, and Jake could almost hear her calculating the implications. A death at their flagship property, 6 hours before his board presentation about safety improvements, would give her directors every excuse they needed to reject his recommendations and question her judgment about hiring him. "How bad is it?" Elena asked finally. "Bad. Experienced skier who might have stayed in bounds if the off-limits areas had been properly marked. It's exactly the kind of preventable death that my safety protocols are designed to prevent." "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Should we postpone the board presentation?" Jake understood what Elena was really asking. Did he want to present his safety improvements to a board of directors who would be dealing with the legal and financial fallout from a safety failure at another property? It would be easier to wait, to let the immediate crisis pass before proposing expensive changes that might seem like overreactions rather than necessary reforms. "No," Jake said without hesitation. "We present today, on schedule. This death proves everything I've been telling you about the cost of inadequate safety measures." The board might see it differently. They might view the timing as opportunistic, like you're exploiting a tragedy to advance your agenda. "Elena, a man died this morning because we didn't spend the money to put up proper warning signs. If the board thinks preventing future deaths is opportunistic, then we're working for the wrong people." 3 hours later, Jake stood in the Whistle Peak Resort administrative offices, reviewing incident reports and boundary maintenance records that painted a damning picture of systemic safety neglect. The ski boundaries hadn't been updated in 18 months, despite known changes in terrain conditions that made certain areas more dangerous. The signage budget had been cut by 40% over the past 2 years as part of company-wide cost reduction initiatives. Most tellingly, the resort safety recommendations had been overruled by corporate management 3 times in the past year when proposed improvements exceeded budget allocations. "Mr. Thompson," David Chen said, approaching Jake with a thick folder of documentation, "I need to show you something that's going to make this situation more complicated." Jake opened the folder to find email exchanges between Whistle Peak Management and Rodriguez Ski Enterprises corporate headquarters. The emails documented a pattern of safety recommendations being rejected or delayed due to budget constraints, with corporate management explicitly prioritizing short-term cost savings over long-term risk mitigation. One email from Elena's CFO was particularly damaging. "Safety improvements that exceed 15% of operational budgets require board approval, which should only be sought for modifications that address immediate regulatory compliance issues rather than theoretical risk scenarios. Jake stared at the email, understanding that the man who died this morning had been killed not by an avalanche, but by a corporate policy that treated human safety as a theoretical concern rather than a practical priority. "How many people know about these emails?" Jake asked. "The victim's family has hired an attorney who's already requested all safety-related correspondence for the past 3 years. These documents will be evidence in the wrongful death lawsuit." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. The board presentation he was supposed to give in 4 hours would now take place in the context of a lawsuit that could expose Rodriguez Ski Enterprises to liability claims worth tens of millions of dollars. And the evidence would show that company leadership had repeatedly chosen cost savings over safety improvements. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Board meeting moved to 4 p.m. They want to discuss Whistle Peak incident before your presentation. Are you ready for this?" Jake looked around the Whistle Peak administrative offices, where staff members were dealing with the aftermath of a death that could have been prevented with a few $1,000s in proper signage. He thought about the safety protocols he'd implemented at Pine Valley, the real-time monitoring systems that had already prevented a dozen incidents from becoming emergencies. He thought about Lily, who would grow up in a world where corporate decisions affected real families in ways that quarterly reports never captured. "I'm ready," he texted back. But as Jake drove from Whistle Peak to Elena's Denver headquarters, he wondered whether Elena was ready for what his presentation would reveal about her company's safety culture. Because the data he'd prepared didn't just demonstrate the need for improved protocols, it exposed a systematic pattern of corporate negligence that had finally resulted in someone's death. The board meeting would force Elena to choose between protecting her company's reputation and acknowledging the failures that had made this morning's tragedy inevitable. And Jake was about to find out whether the woman who'd hired him to prevent deaths was prepared to take responsibility for the deaths her company had failed to prevent. Elena was waiting in the conference room when Jake arrived, her expression carefully controlled but her hands shaking slightly as she reviewed his presentation materials. "Jake, before we go in there, I need you to understand what's at stake. The board has the authority to terminate your position, reject your recommendations, and potentially remove me as CEO if they decide my judgment has been compromised. What do you want me to do?" Elena looked at Jake with an expression that reminded him of the moment in the avalanche debris when she'd realized her life was in his hands. "I want you to tell them the truth, even if it destroys everything I've built." Jake nodded, understanding that the next hour would determine not just their professional futures, but whether Rodriguez Ski Enterprises would become the kind of company that prevented tragedies, or the kind that rationalized them after they happened. The Rodriguez Ski Enterprises boardroom felt like a courtroom when Jake entered at 3:55 p.m. 8 directors sat around a mahogany table that probably cost more than Jake had earned in his first year at Pine Valley, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Elena sat at the head of the table, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like barely controlled anxiety. "Directors, thank you for accommodating the schedule change," Elena began, her voice professionally steady despite the circumstances. "As you're all aware, we had a fatality at Whistle Peak Resort this morning. Before we discuss Mr. Thompson's safety recommendations, I believe we need to address the immediate crisis." Board Chairman Robert Hayes, a silver-haired man who'd been questioning Elena's leadership decisions for months, leaned forward with the expression of someone preparing to deliver a killing blow. "Elena, we've reviewed the preliminary incident report. This morning's death appears to be the result of a skier's poor judgment in entering unmarked backcountry terrain. While tragic, it doesn't seem to indicate any failure of resort safety protocols." Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Hayes was already constructing a narrative that would absolve the company of responsibility, painting the death as an unavoidable accident rather than the predictable result of inadequate safety measures. "Mr. Hayes, with respect, that assessment is incorrect," Jake said, his voice cutting through the boardroom's polished atmosphere like a blade through silk. "The skier died because he couldn't determine where safe terrain ended and dangerous terrain began. That's not poor judgment. That's inadequate boundary marking." Hayes, expression sharpened with displeasure. "Mr. Thompson, you've been with the company for less than a month. I'm not sure you're qualified to assess the adequacy of safety protocols that have been in place for years." "I'm qualified to assess dead bodies, Mr. Hayes." And this morning I stood next to one that wouldn't exist if this company spent as much money on warning signs as it spends on boardroom furniture." The silence that followed Jake's statement was absolute. Several directors exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering whether Elena's judgment in hiring him had been catastrophically poor. But Jake was no longer concerned about corporate politics or career preservation. He was thinking about the family that would receive news of their loved one's death, and the pattern of preventable tragedies that would continue unless someone forced this board to confront uncomfortable truths. Elena cleared her throat, her face pale but her voice determined. "Jake, perhaps you could walk the board through your analysis of this morning's incident." Jake opened his laptop and projected his presentation onto the boardroom's wall-mounted screen. The first slide showed a map of Whistle Peak Resort with the Avalanche site clearly marked, just beyond a boundary that existed on paper but wasn't visible to skiers on the mountain. "This is where Michael Harrison died this morning," Jake said, using the victim's name deliberately to remind the board that they were discussing a person, not a liability statistic. He was an expert skier with 15 years of backcountry experience. The avalanche that killed him occurred in terrain that's been known to be unstable for the past 18 months. Jake clicked to the next slide, showing photographs of the boundary area where warning signs should have been installed. This is what Mr. Harrison saw when he made the decision to ski into that terrain. No visible boundaries, no warning signs, no indication that he was leaving the resort's controlled area. Board member Jennifer Walsh raised her hand with a question that Jake had been expecting. "Mr. Thompson, isn't it reasonable to expect experienced skiers to understand the risks of unmarked terrain?" "Ms. Walsh, is it reasonable to expect customers to navigate safety hazards that we know exist but haven't bothered to mark? Would you drive on a highway where the transportation department knew about dangerous curves but decided not to install warning signs because experienced drivers should be able to figure it out themselves?" Jake clicked to his most damaging slide, the email correspondence between Whistle Peak management and corporate headquarters. For the past 18 months, Whistle Peak's mountain safety director has requested budget approval to update boundary signage and install avalanche warning systems. Every request has been denied or delayed due to cost concerns. He read directly from CFO Martin Fisher's email. "Safety improvements that exceed 15% of operational budgets require board approval, which should only be sought for modifications that address immediate regulatory compliance issues rather than theoretical risk scenarios." Fisher, who was sitting 3 seats to Elena's left, visibly flinched as his own words were read back to him. That email was taken out of context. "We were trying to establish reasonable budget guidelines for safety expenditures." Mr. Fisher, Michael Harrison's death this morning proves that avalanche risk isn't theoretical. It's predictable, preventable, and fatal when we choose to ignore it. Jake advanced to his next slide, showing incident data from across all Rodriguez properties. In the past 18 months, we've had 47 avalanche-related rescues, 12 serious injuries, and now 1 death. Every incident occurred in areas where improved signage or boundary marking had been recommended and rejected. Hayes was looking increasingly uncomfortable as the data painted a picture of systematic negligence rather than isolated incidents. "Mr. Thompson, are you suggesting that this company has been deliberately endangering its customers?" "I'm suggesting that this company has been treating safety improvements as optional expenses rather than essential investments. The result is that we're spending millions on lawsuit settlements instead of thousands on prevention." Jake clicked to his final slide, showing the comprehensive safety proposal he'd developed over the past month. Real-time avalanche monitoring, standardized boundary marking, mandatory safety training for all staff, and emergency response protocols that could prevent incidents from becoming tragedies. Implementation cost across all properties, $2.8 million. Annual savings in reduced insurance premiums and avoided litigation, $6.2 million. Lives saved, impossible to calculate, but certainly more than 0. Elena was watching the board's faces as Jake presented his data, seeing the calculations happening behind their eyes as they weighed financial costs against legal liabilities. She'd spent years learning to read these expressions, understanding when directors were positioning themselves to support or oppose initiatives based on political rather than practical considerations. "Questions?" Jake asked, closing his laptop and facing the board directly. Walsh spoke first, her tone more respectful than it had been earlier. "Mr. Thompson, assuming the board approves your safety recommendations, what guarantees can you provide that we won't face similar incidents in the future?" None, Jake replied without hesitation. Mountains are dangerous, weather is unpredictable, and people make poor decisions. But I can guarantee that every death on our properties will be investigated by lawyers who will ask whether we implemented reasonable safety measures. This morning's fatality could result in a wrongful death judgment that costs more than my entire safety program. Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting he was processing information that complicated his initial opposition to Jake's recommendations. Elena, what's your assessment of Mr. Thompson's proposal? Elena looked at Jake, then at the board members who'd been questioning her leadership for months, and made a decision that would define both her company's future and her own integrity. My assessment is that we've been prioritizing short-term cost savings over long-term safety, and this morning someone died because of it. Mr. Thompson's recommendations aren't just prudent, they're overdue. We should have implemented these protocols years ago. Fisher shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Elena, that statement could be interpreted as an admission of negligence in the current litigation. Martin, this morning's death is an admission of negligence. The question is whether we're going to continue the policies that caused it or implement the changes that will prevent it from happening again. Elena's declaration hung in the boardroom air like a challenge, forcing each director to choose between protecting the company's legal position and protecting the lives of future customers. Jake realized he was watching Elena Rodriguez transform from a CEO who managed corporate risk into a leader who took personal responsibility for corporate failures. The vote, when it came, would determine not just the future of Rodriguez Ski Enterprises, safety protocols, but whether Elena would survive as CEO and whether Jake's approach to corporate accountability would find acceptance in an industry built on calculated risk management. The board voted 5-3 against implementing Jake's safety recommendations. Elena sat in her Denver penthouse at 11 p.m. that night, staring at the city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows that had once made her feel like she ruled the world. Now they felt like barriers separating her from a reality she'd been avoiding for too long. The vote had been closer than expected. Jake's presentation had clearly affected some directors, but the result was the same. Rodriguez Ski Enterprises would continue operating under safety protocols that had just proven fatal. Her phone had been ringing constantly since the board meeting ended, legal counsel wanting to discuss litigation strategy, public relations teams crafting statements that would minimize corporate liability, insurance representatives calculating premium increases that would result from the wrongful death lawsuit. Everyone wanted to manage the crisis, but no one wanted to address the fundamental problem that had caused it. The worst call had come from Martin Fisher at 9:30 p.m. Elena, I need you to understand the position you've put the company in, her CFO had said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Your admission of negligence this afternoon could cost us $50 million in damages if this lawsuit goes to trial. The legal team is considering whether your statements constitute grounds for shareholder action against your leadership. Elena had hung up without responding, finally understanding that her board of directors viewed accountability as a liability rather than a responsibility. They weren't interested in preventing future deaths. They were interested in protecting themselves from consequences of past failures. At 11:47 p.m., her assistant Patricia called with news that Elena had been dreading. Ms. Rodriguez, Jake Thompson submitted his resignation an hour ago, effective immediately. He's requested that his final paycheck be donated to the Michael Harrison Family Relief Fund. Elena closed her eyes, feeling something break inside her chest. Jake had lasted exactly 4 weeks as Director of Mountain Safety Operations, before discovering that corporate leadership was incompatible with moral integrity. She'd hired him because his values reminded her of who she used to be, and now she'd lost him because those same values were incompatible with who she'd become. Meanwhile, Jake was sitting in his truck in the Pine Valley Lodge parking lot, trying to figure out how to explain to Lily that they'd be moving again. The resignation letter had been the easiest document he'd ever written. 3 sentences stating that he couldn't work for a company that viewed preventable deaths as acceptable business risks. But the conversation with his 8-year-old daughter would be infinitely more difficult. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Please don't leave like this. Can we talk? Jake stared at the message for several minutes before typing back. There's nothing to talk about. Your board made it clear that they value profit margins more than human lives. I can't be part of that. The vote was 5-3. That means we only need to change 2 minds. Elena, a man died this morning because your company repeatedly chose cost savings over safety improvements. Your board just voted to continue those same policies. How many more people need to die before you decide that's unacceptable? His phone rang immediately, Elena's name appearing on the caller ID. Jake almost didn't answer, but something in the urgency of her immediate callback made him pick up. Jake, please, I know how this looks, but… How this looks? Jake's voice carried an anger that surprised him with its intensity. Elena, this isn't about appearances or corporate politics. This is about whether you're running a ski company or a death trap. Your board just voted for the death trap. I can change their minds. Give me time to build support for your recommendations. How much time? How many families need to lose someone while you're building consensus? How many preventable deaths are acceptable while you navigate corporate politics? Elena was quiet for so long that Jake thought the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. What if I told you I was thinking about resigning too? The admission caught Jake off guard. Elena Rodriguez walking away from the empire she'd built seemed impossible. She was Rodriguez Ski Enterprises in a way that transcended normal CEO relationships. The company existed because of her vision, her drive, her ruthless competence in building something larger than herself. Why would you do that? Because I hired you to help me remember what it felt like to do the right thing, and the board just proved that doing the right thing is incompatible with running this company. Jake sat in his truck, processing Elena's words and recognizing the same disillusionment that had driven his resignation. They'd both believed that corporate leadership could be reformed from within, that good intentions and solid data could overcome institutional resistance to change. The board vote had proven them both naive. Elena, what happens to the safety improvements if you resign? What happens to preventing future incidents like this morning? I don't know. The board would probably appoint Fisher as interim CEO, and he's already proven his position on safety expenditures. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach as he considered the implications. Elena's resignation would eliminate any chance of implementing safety reforms, would ensure that Rodriguez Ski Enterprises continued operating under policies that prioritized cost savings over human life. Her departure would be a moral victory that accomplished nothing practical. There's something else, Elena continued. I've been getting calls from other ski resort companies all evening. Word is spreading about your safety presentation, about the data you presented to the board. Aspen Mountain Group wants to hire you as their Director of Risk Management. Vail Resorts is interested in your monitoring systems. You could have your choice of positions with companies that might be more receptive to your recommendations. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that his failure at Rodriguez Ski Enterprises was creating opportunities with their competitors. But the idea of starting over at another company, building trust with another management team, seemed exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with professional ambition and everything to do with moral fatigue. Jake, are you still there? Yeah, I'm here, just thinking. What if we tried a different approach? What if, instead of working within the existing corporate structure, we created something new? Jake wasn't sure what Elena was suggesting, but the tone of her voice had changed from defeated to calculating, as if she was processing possibilities in real time. What do you mean? I mean, what if we started our own company? Independent mountain safety consulting, working with resorts that actually want to prevent incidents rather than manage liability. We'd have credibility. You have the technical expertise. I have the industry relationships. We could implement your safety protocols at properties whose management actually wants to save lives. The suggestion was so unexpected that Jake needed several seconds to process it. Elena Rodriguez, worth billions of dollars and commanding one of the largest ski resort empires in North America, was proposing to walk away from everything she'd built to start a safety consulting firm with a maintenance worker she'd known for a month. Elena, that's crazy. You'd be giving up everything you've spent your life building. I'd be trading something I built for something I could be proud of. There's a difference. Jake looked through his windshield at Pine Valley Lodge, where he'd spent the happiest month of his professional life implementing safety improvements that had already prevented multiple incidents. He thought about Michael Harrison's family, about the lawsuit that would drag on for years while other families face similar risks at other properties. He thought about Lily, who deserved a father who could look at himself in the mirror without feeling complicit in preventable tragedies. If we did this, Jake said carefully, it would have to be a real partnership. equal say in decisions, shared ownership, genuine collaboration. I won't be your employee or your charity case. Partners, Elena agreed immediately. 50-50 ownership, shared decision-making, combined expertise. We'd be small, but we'd be honest. Jake closed his eyes, feeling something that might have been hope stirring in his chest for the first time since the board vote. When do we start? Elena Rodriguez submitted her resignation as CEO of Rodriguez Ski Enterprises at 8 a.m. the following Monday, exactly 72 hours after the board vote that had changed everything. The resignation letter was brief and devastating. Effective immediately, I am stepping down as Chief Executive Officer to pursue opportunities that align with my personal values and professional integrity. The financial markets reacted immediately. Rodriguez Ski Enterprises stock dropped 18% in the first hour of trading, as investors processed the implications of the founder and controlling shareholder abandoning the company she'd built. Business media outlets scrambled to understand why a billionaire would walk away from her empire at the height of ski season, the most profitable period of the year. Jake was in his truck driving Lily to her new school in Boulder when his phone started buzzing with notifications. News alerts, text messages, missed calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten his number. He pulled over and opened the first news article, reading Elena's resignation statement with a mixture of admiration and terror. "Daddy, why did you stop?" Lily asked from the passenger seat, where she'd been quietly working on a coloring book that featured mountain scenes. "Just checking something, sweetheart. Adult stuff." But it wasn't just adult stuff. Elena's resignation meant their partnership was real, that they were actually going to attempt building a safety consulting firm from scratch. It meant Elena Rodriguez, one of the most powerful executives in American business, had chosen integrity over wealth, had risked everything on the belief that their shared values could translate into sustainable business. His phone rang with Elena's number. "Did you see the news?" she asked without preamble. "Kind of hard to miss. Are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Jake. I spent 15 years building a company that I couldn't respect. I'd rather spend the next 15 years building something I can be proud of." Jake looked in his rearview mirror at Lily, who had resumed her coloring with the focused concentration that 8-year-olds brought to creative projects. His daughter deserved stability, predictable income, health insurance that wasn't dependent on the success of a startup venture that might fail within 6 months. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. What happens if this doesn't work? What happens if we can't build a sustainable business?" "Then we fail together, and we learn something about the difference between worthwhile risks and reckless gambles." The answer was exactly what Jake had hoped she'd say, and exactly what terrified him about their partnership. Elena Rodriguez didn't think small, didn't plan for modest success or acceptable compromise. She approached business challenges with the same intensity that had built Rodriguez Ski Enterprises, which could be either an incredible advantage or a spectacular disaster. "Where do we start?" Jake asked. "We start with the clients who've been calling me since Thursday night. Aspen Mountain Group wants to hire us for a comprehensive safety audit. Whistler Resort is interested in implementing your monitoring systems. Mammoth Mountain asked if we could design emergency response protocols that would prevent the kind of incident that happened at Whistle Peak." Jake felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that their partnership might actually have commercial viability beyond idealistic intentions. Resort companies that had watched Rodriguez Ski Enterprises struggle with safety failures were apparently eager to invest in solutions that would prevent similar problems. How many properties are we talking about? 12 resorts across 6 states, with the possibility of expanding to Canadian properties if our initial projects are successful. Jake, we could be looking at $2 million in consulting revenue in our first year. The number hit Jake like a physical blow. $2 million was more money than he'd earned in the past 5 years combined. Enough to provide Lily with stability he'd never been able to offer. Enough to stop making decisions based on financial desperation. But more importantly, it represented the possibility of preventing incidents like Michael Harrison's death at multiple properties, of implementing safety protocols that could save dozens of lives over the course of a ski season. 3 weeks later, Jake stood on the summit of Aspen Mountain with Elena, reviewing the Avalanche monitoring equipment they'd installed as part of their first major consulting contract. The system represented everything he'd tried to implement at Rodriguez Ski Enterprises: real-time weather monitoring, automated risk assessment, emergency response protocols that could prevent incidents from becoming tragedies. The sensors are picking up wind patterns that suggest increasing avalanche risk on the north-facing slopes, Elena said, checking the tablet that displayed data from across the mountain. Do you want to recommend closing those areas? Jake studied the meteorological data, recognizing conditions that were similar to those that had killed Michael Harrison. 6 months ago, corporate management would have resisted closure recommendations due to revenue concerns. Today, Aspen Mountain's management had given Jake complete authority to make safety decisions based on mountain conditions rather than business considerations. Close the north face until conditions stabilize, Jake said. Better to disappoint skiers than to bury them. Elena made the call to Aspen's mountain operations, watching Jake work with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd made the right choice about partnership. Their consulting firm, Summit Safety Solutions, had exceeded every financial projection, but more importantly, it had prevented 17 potential incidents in its first 3 months of operation. Jake, there's something I need to tell you, Elena said as they prepared to descend the mountain. I got a call from Rodriguez Ski Enterprises yesterday. The board wants to hire us to conduct safety audits at all their properties. Jake stopped adjusting his ski bindings and looked up at Elena with an expression that suggested he wasn't sure whether to laugh or be offended. They want to hire us to fix the problems they refused to let us fix when we worked for them? The wrongful death lawsuit is costing them more than they anticipated, and their insurance company is demanding comprehensive safety improvements as a condition for continued coverage. They need our expertise. What did you tell them? Elena smiled with an expression that carried both satisfaction and something that might have been forgiveness. I told them our consulting rate for Rodriguez properties would be triple our standard fee, and that all safety recommendations would be implemented without modification or budget limitations. And they agreed? They agreed. Sometimes it takes losing everything to understand what you should have valued all along. As they skied down Aspen Mountain together, Jake found himself thinking about the avalanche that had brought them together, about Elena buried under 15 feet of snow while he dug frantically to save her life. He'd pulled her from what should have been her grave, but in many ways, she'd saved his life too. She'd shown him that meaningful work was possible, that integrity and financial success weren't mutually exclusive, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was walk away from everything you'd built to create something better. His phone buzzed with a text from Lily, who was spending the afternoon with Mrs. Chen while Jake and Elena completed their Aspen consultation. Daddy, I drew a picture of you and Elena on the mountain. You look happy. Jake showed the text to Elena, who laughed with genuine delight. She's right, you know, we do look happy. Jake studied Elena's face, seeing in her expression the same contentment he felt every morning when he woke up knowing that his work was preventing tragedies rather than managing them after they happened. They'd both lost everything they thought they wanted and discovered something they hadn't known they needed. We should get going, Elena said. We have that meeting with Whistler Resort tomorrow, and I want to review their incident reports tonight. As they skied toward the base lodge, Jake realized that he was no longer the broke single father who'd barely been able to afford plane tickets home. But more importantly, he was no longer someone who had to choose between his principles and his daughter's welfare. He'd found a way to provide for Lily while doing work that mattered, with a partner who shared his commitment to preventing preventable tragedies. Sometimes, Jake thought, the best rescue was the one that saved everyone involved. 2 years after the avalanche that changed everything, Jake Thompson stood in the main hall of the newly constructed Summit Safety Training Center, watching Elena Rodriguez teach a group of mountain rescue specialists how to use the avalanche monitoring technology they developed together. The facility, built in the mountains outside Boulder, Colorado, had become the premier destination for ski resort safety training in North America. The key to preventing avalanche fatalities isn't just predicting when slides will occur. Elena was explaining to the assembled trainees, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd nearly died under an avalanche herself. It's creating systems that give people enough information to make informed decisions about risk. Jake smiled, remembering the terrified woman he'd pulled from the snow 2 years ago. That Elena had been brilliant but disconnected from the human consequences of corporate decisions. This Elena understood that technology was only valuable when it protected real people, making real choices on dangerous mountains. The training center represented everything Summit Safety Solutions had accomplished since their partnership began. What had started as a consulting firm had evolved into a comprehensive safety education organization that trained rescue personnel, developed monitoring equipment, and created protocols that had been adopted by over 40 ski resorts across North America. "Daddy, look what I made!" Lily's voice carried across the training hall as she ran toward Jake, carrying a science project that looked suspiciously like a miniature avalanche detection system. At 10 years old, she'd become fascinated with the technology that defined her father's work, spending afternoons at the training center building her own versions of weather monitoring equipment. "That's incredible, sweetheart," Jake said, kneeling down to examine Lily's creation. "How does it work?" "It measures snow density and temperature changes, just like the big ones Elena showed me. When the numbers get dangerous, it sends an alert to this radio." Lily proudly displayed a small two-way radio she'd somehow incorporated into her project. Elena finished her presentation and walked over to join them, her expression lighting up as she saw Lily's latest engineering project. Over the past 2 years, Elena had become something between a mentor and a second parent to Lily, teaching her about technology and business, while Jake handled the more traditional aspects of child rearing. "Lily, that's brilliant," Elena said, examining the miniature monitoring system with genuine admiration. "Have you tested it yet?" "We were waiting for you to get finished teaching. Daddy said we could test it in the snow simulation chamber." The snow simulation chamber was Jake's pride and joy, a climate-controlled facility where they could recreate avalanche conditions for training purposes without risking human lives. It had been Elena's idea, but Jake had designed the engineering systems that made it possible to study avalanche behavior in a laboratory setting. As they walked toward the simulation chamber, Jake's phone buzzed with a notification from the resort monitoring network they'd established. Automated alerts from weather stations across Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, providing real-time avalanche risk assessment to mountain operations teams at 37 different properties. "Anything urgent?" Elena asked, recognizing Jake's expression as he reviewed the data. "Just the usual winter storm patterns." Whistle Peak has elevated avalanche risk on their north-facing slopes, but their mountain operations team already closed those areas based on our recommendations. Elena nodded, satisfied that the systems they'd built were functioning as intended. Whistle Peak Resort, formerly part of Rodriguez Ski Enterprises, had become one of their most successful implementation projects, transforming from a property with multiple safety incidents to a model of comprehensive risk management. "Elena, can I ask you something?" Lily said as they entered the simulation chamber. "Do you ever miss being the boss of all those ski mountains?" Elena paused, considering the question with the seriousness she always brought to Lily's inquiries. "Sometimes I miss the feeling of building something big and important, but I don't miss making decisions that put people in danger to save money." "Do you like working with Daddy better than working by yourself?" "Much better. Your father keeps me honest about what really matters." Jake felt something warm settle in his chest as he listened to Elena's response. Their partnership had evolved beyond professional collaboration into something that felt like family, though neither of them had attempted to define it in traditional terms. Elena had her own apartment in Boulder, but she spent most evenings at Jake and Lily's house, helping with homework and sharing dinners that had become the most stable routine Lily had ever known. The snow simulation chamber hummed to life as Jake activated the climate controls, creating conditions that would test Lily's monitoring system under controlled circumstances. As artificial snow began falling in the chamber, Lily's device immediately started collecting data, its small screen displaying temperature and density readings that closely matched the professional equipment mounted nearby. "It's working," Lily announced with triumph. "Look, the numbers are exactly the same as the big machine." Elena and Jake exchanged a look that carried shared pride in Lily's accomplishment and shared amazement at how much their lives had changed since that morning when Jake had dug Elena out of an avalanche that should have killed her. "You know what this means," Elena said, addressing Lily with mock seriousness. "You're ready for advanced training. Next week, we'll start teaching you how to analyze weather patterns and predict avalanche conditions." Lily's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? You mean I could learn to do what you and Daddy do?" "If you want to," Jake said. "But remember, this work is about keeping people safe. It's a big responsibility." "I know, Daddy. Like when you saved Elena from the avalanche, you didn't think about whether it was hard or dangerous. You just did what needed to be done." Jake felt something catch in his throat as he heard his own values reflected in his daughter's understanding of their work. Lily had grown up watching him and Elena build something meaningful together, had learned that success meant more than financial achievement, that the most important work was often the most challenging. As they finished testing Lily's monitoring system, Jake's phone rang with a call from Dr. Sarah Martinez, Lily's pediatrician. These calls no longer triggered panic the way they had 2 years ago, when every medical consultation had been a financial crisis. "Mr. Thompson, I wanted to update you on Lily's latest pulmonary function tests. Her lung capacity has improved significantly over the past year, and we're considering reducing her medication dosage." Jake closed his eyes, feeling gratitude that still surprised him with its intensity. Lily's health had stabilized not just because of better medical care, but because their lives had become less stressful, more predictable, more secure. The constant anxiety that had characterized their early years had been replaced by the kind of stability that allowed children to focus on growing instead of surviving. "That's wonderful news, Dr. Martinez. What do you recommend for next steps?" "Continue her current activity level, maintain the air filtration system in your home, and keep doing whatever you're doing. Lily's thriving in ways that go beyond her respiratory health."
After Dr. Martinez hung up, Jake found Elena and Lily in the training center's main office, where Elena was showing Lily how to read topographical maps and identify terrain features that indicated avalanche risk. The sight of them together, heads bent over maps and data charts, represented everything Jake had hoped for but never dared to expect. "Good news?" Elena asked, recognizing Jake's expression. "The best news, Lily's health is improving, her monitoring system works perfectly, and we have 3 new client contracts starting next month." Elena smiled with the contentment that had replaced the driven intensity that had once defined her approach to success. Not bad for a failed CEO and a former maintenance worker. "Not bad at all," Jake agreed, looking around the training center that had become more than a business. It had become a place where they were preventing tragedies, teaching skills that saved lives, and building something that would outlast both of them. Lily looked up from the topographical maps with the serious expression she wore when processing important information. "Daddy, Elena, are we going to keep doing this forever?" Jake and Elena exchanged another look, this one carrying questions about futures they hadn't explicitly discussed, but had been building toward through every shared decision and collaborative project. "As long as people need to be safe on mountains," Elena said finally, "and as long as we can help make that happen." "Good," Lily said, returning to her maps with satisfaction. "I like it when we all work together." As evening approached and they prepared to close the training center for the day, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, he'd been a broke single father who'd helped a stranger because it was the right thing to do. That stranger had turned out to be someone who would transform his life, not through charity or gratitude, but through partnership based on shared values and mutual respect. Together, they'd built something that mattered, something that prevented families from experiencing the kind of preventable tragedies that had once seemed inevitable. Something that proved corporate success and moral integrity weren't mutually exclusive, that the most profitable approach was often the most ethical approach. But more than that, they'd built a family. Not the traditional kind defined by legal documents or ceremonial declarations, but the kind that emerged when people chose to take care of each other, to share both struggles and successes, to create stability through commitment rather than circumstance. As they walked to their cars under a Colorado sky full of stars, Jake realized that the rescue that had started everything hadn't ended when he'd pulled Elena from the avalanche. It had continued through every decision they'd made to choose integrity over convenience, partnership over independence, long-term purpose over short-term profit. They'd rescued each other, and in doing so had discovered that the most meaningful success came not from what you could build alone, but from what you could create together when you shared the same vision of what really mattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new clients, new opportunities to prevent tragedies through technology and training, and the simple recognition that every person on every mountain deserved to make it home safely to their families. But tonight, driving home through the mountains where their story had begun, Jake Thompson felt like the richest man in the world. New. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.